Good afternoon. Welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, the Children's Bureau. Today's webinar is on cloud computing service models with guidance and technical assistance brought to you by the State Systems team. Today's webinar presenters are Terry Watt, Director, State Systems Division.
Who's on here?
I'm sorry?
Nicole
Harter-Shafer, Federal Analyst, and Nick Gompper, ICF Technology Specialist. Attendees are encouraged to participate and ask questions and/or comments at specific time frames throughout the webinar. All of the participant lines will be muted now, but we will open them for question and answers. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will be queued up and addressed during the question and answer session. Once today's webinar is completed, you may submit additional questions to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov or at any time at your convenience to your federal analyst. Our discussion topics for today will include an overview of service models as a service. We'll walk through primary service model comparisons. We'll discuss as a service selection considerations, commercial off-the-shelf or COTS products, and we'll close with multi-model implementations and cloud as a service selection considerations.
To deal with him.
Terry, yeah, well, Nicole works for Terry.
Nicole Harter-Shafer, I am turning it over to you.
A graphic showing a large city with overpasses and intersections. The 4 intersections are labeled Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS, Platform as a Service, PaaS, Software as a Service, SaaS, and Commercial Off-the-Shelf, COTS product.
We're going to discuss the as-a-service journey. Which road will you choose? So the beginning piece is the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software and COTS, meaning where are you as a state looking and what your vision is. There are a lot of choices. So we want to make sure that today we go over and make sure everyone understands the different models, and we discuss the solution responsibilities and what's dependent on the model you choose with regard to guidance and things to consider along the way. So, De Niro, next slide, please. Nick Gompper, I'll hand that over to you.
The slide compares the 3 models: Infrastructure as a Service, Platform as a Service, and Software as a Service model. The graphics show the list of the components, which include applications, security, databases, operating systems, virtualization, physical servers, physical storage, physical networking, and data centers. For the Infrastructure as a Service model, cloud services include processing, storage, networks, and other fundamental computing resources. There is no consumer control of the underlying cloud infrastructure. Consumers have control over the operating system, storage, and deployed applications. For the Platform as a Service model, consumers deploy applications in the cloud using cloud service provider programming languages, libraries, services, and tools. Consumers have control over deployed applications and some environment configurations, but not over infrastructure, operating systems, and storage. For the Software as a Service model, provider's application is deployed on a cloud infrastructure. The application is accessible via web browser. There is no consumer management of cloud infrastructure or application capabilities. There are limited user-specific application configuration settings.
Good day, everyone. So what I'm
going to do is go through each one of these primary as-a-service offerings: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. These are the particular as-a-service offerings specified by the federal government, specifically in a NIST special publication, the NIST definition of cloud computing, recommendations of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which of course is NIST itself. So starting with infrastructure as a service, the definition, or an abbreviated version of the definition, is at the top of the slide. So it incorporates processing, storage, networks, and other fundamental computing resources. The consumer or customer has no control of the underlying cloud infrastructure, but they do control operating systems, storage, and deployed applications. So you can think of infrastructure as a service as one that allows for the provisioning of base, virtualized in particular, computing resources. That means virtual machine instances, networks, and data storage components. A good analogy for this is if somebody buys you a home computer, but it has nothing on it. It doesn't even have an operating system. It has a disk drive and it has a CPU. For most people, this is not a gift they'd be enthusiastic to receive, but for some techie people out there, they might be very excited. And this is sort of the building block of cloud services. Everything tends to be on top of infrastructure as a service. So platform as a service, again with the definition from NIST, the consumers deploy applications in the cloud using cloud service provider. Sometimes you'll see that as CSP, provided programming languages, libraries, services, and other tools. The consumer basically controls what they build with those programming languages, libraries, and services. They also have some control over environmental configurations, but not over the underlying infrastructure, operating systems, and storage. So in the graphic, you can see that all the gray areas, those are things managed by the cloud service provider, whereas the customer or consumer manages the applications on top of that. Now, the reality is that platform as a service has a broad scope depending on interpretation. Typically, for platforms targeting developers, these might be PaaS offerings that allow for deployment and manage computing platforms or environments. So it might help, for example, for scalability. You build an app and you leverage the platform as a service to scale that app in the cloud and not have to manage that underlying component. Other platform as a service offerings may target both developers as well as business analysts and may, for example, facilitate the establishment of forms and workflow-based applications. These are fairly commonly used, especially for larger systems. And thirdly, some business intelligence platforms, are available to facilitate creation of reports and provide information insights. These are all examples of platform as a service. So SAS offerings, on the other hand, these are situations where the cloud service provider essentially handles everything. They're making an application available to consumers in the cloud. The consumer management of cloud infrastructure or application capabilities is non-existent, and where they do have some impact is on configuration, but usually only on the user-specific level. These are basically fully functional applications in the cloud. So, for example, states or tribes are responsible for appropriate use of the service, and including quality control on data. But beyond that, they're not responsible for anything for the actual software itself. It's worth noting that SAS-based offerings are typically established on top of platforms, which are in turn established on top of infrastructure as a service. So that's something I'll sort of repeat a couple times, is that these things are not mutually exclusive. One other thing worth noting is that the distinction between software as a service and platform as a service can be a little blurred insofar as whereas some software as a service offerings work out of the box, they also may incorporate APIs and mechanisms to build and customize their own software, thus making them themselves a platform as a service as well. So you get some of these gray areas for that. Like a good example of that is a customer relationship management platform as a service that is in turn customized for a child welfare specific requirement and then is marketed as software as a service. So this is again reiterating the relatively complex nature of this, that you're not choosing either infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or software as a service. Many of these things may come into play. You may build a core application on top of a platform as a service framework. It may leverage an application database that's on a infrastructure as a service instance that is manually configured. It in turn may access multiple software as a service offerings. I've circled a few of these, for example, for API management, for security, for business intelligence and reporting, for content management, for search, etc. And then there may be other services that are leveraged in terms of a core platform, not necessarily part of your base system, but that may interface with other systems as well. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Terry to provide a federal perspective on some of this.
So I'll take that. So really, when you're evaluating your state or tribal needs, making sure that you understand what current resources that you have within your state, and making sure really that your child welfare system works for your program and works for your state. When we talk about costs, meeting the 3 E's for efficient, effective, and economical really come down to evaluating what the long-term benefits are for your state for the costs and selection. So making sure that you can make changes quickly to whatever you choose, so that it meets changing program needs. And when we talk about providers and tools being agnostic, we at the federal level don't endorse one product or another. So putting together a business case that defines what your needs are is really important. And I'll pause. Mr. Watt, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you pointed the emphasis is on the state's need. A tool that might fit the state of Nevada perfectly won't work for the state of disorder. So you're focusing on your needs, your program vision is what really should matter. We don't endorse any other products. If a vendor's telling you they're CWIS compliant or that we think they're the best thing since sliced bread, is not telling you the truth. We will always let you decide what tools, what systems, what providers meet your needs, and then write a business case to us explaining this is why this tool meets our needs. Go ahead, Nicole.
Okay. So understanding exactly what Terry says means that when you're looking to develop a CWIS compliant system, the reality of that is taking the time to understand what the state needs, and that procedures and programs are different in every state. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And as Terry said, what worked in the state of Nirvana won't work in your state just because they've completed and built their CWIS system. So there's not a perfect answer to every question except to say that what are the struggles for your state programmatically, how do you need to meet them, and that's what we're looking at. And enterprise solutions regarding benefiting programs and the cost allocation. If you, for example, plan to share a platform and child welfare will be part of your platform, you need to allocate the cost to all the benefiting programs that are part of your enterprise solution. So making sure that everyone pays their fair share is necessary. And you can work with your federal analysts to go through any questions that you have specific to your state. But anytime you're sharing anything with any of your programs, you need to make sure that all of the costs are allocated to all of the benefiting programs, whether that's a little bit or a lot. So, next slide.
Hey, Nicole, before we go on, I heard from a consultant that Medicaid would pay 90% FFP for the entire platform because, you know, the kids running through that platform will all be eligible for Medicaid. So, is that correct? It's a setup
Thank
question.
you, Mr. Watt. No, that's not correct. Again, everybody has to pay their fair share. And the A87 exemption waiver is no longer in place. So the process for looking at something as a primary program no longer exists. Everyone that is part of that shared service is required to pay their share. Mr. Watt, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you very much.
Next slide. Okay. So do we have any questions?
And Nicole, this is Nicole. I am checking our question box queue. We currently don't have any questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to either raise your hand just by hitting the little raised hand icon, or you can submit a question via the chat box. And with that, Nicole, I would propose we go to the next slide, De Niro.
Yep.
Nick Gompper, we're turning it over to you.
Thank you. So now we're talking a little bit about commercial off-the-shelf software, often known as COTS. So COTS the key thing about COTS is that it's commercial software that is sold in substantial quantities in the commercial marketplace and is offered to the government in the same form. That is to say, this isn't something customized for the government. It's not build, one version of it and sell it to the government. This is stuff that basically the consumer in the commercial market needs to be able to purchase. One thing that's important to note is that software as a service itself can be considered a variant of COTS, which basically makes the commercial software available over the internet. That's actually more and more you see software sold that way. COTS itself is an option within cloud environments as well. So, for example, a consumer of a COTS product may choose to install that inside an infrastructure as a service environment that they've configured and installed an instance in, and they may install their COTS software. If it's managed by the cloud service provider itself, however, it would be considered a SaaS implementation. Next slide. So I talked earlier about there being basically three main as-a-service models. But for any of you who have looked around the internet at the different cloud service models, you've probably noticed that there are actually far more than this. Most of them, however, can be considered a subcategory of one of the existing three that we've called out and that the federal government recognizes. But I just want to give you a glimpse into some of these and how they relate to the existing three primary models. You may also see the expression X as a service, where X basically refers to anything. So there's all sorts of as-a-services available nowadays, and it's actually not always critically important to know which of the three primary ones they are descended from, but just to know how they're used and where they may apply to your application. So in this example diagram, what we have is a user accessing a child welfare application, which may itself be a custom one or something that they've implemented on a platform as a service environment, possibly even a software as a service environment. That in turn leverages a variety of other services. And what I've done is key these in some color so that to differentiate those as-a-service models, extended as-a-service models, and how they relate to the existing platform as a service and software as a service models. So, for example, it's using the data as a service, which is a variant of software as a service, to access multiple data sources. What data as a service does essentially is to produce a unified interface for the varied data that's available, so that your application only needs to speak to those data in a consistent way. Another common thing that's available is you'll see it mainly referenced as a serverless environment, but you'll often see function as a service as well. So these are situations where the cloud service provider provides an environment where you can build programs that are in turn called by your application. So they actually don't have any underlying infrastructure that's running until the actual service is called. So I build a service to calculate the addition of two numbers. My child welfare application calls that, and it returns the sum of those two numbers. And that's an example of a function as a service. And you can see that that itself is a variant of the platform as a service offering, insofar as the serverless environment provides a platform for creating these functions. Other ones we show here are the search as a service, which is represented as a software as a service variant. It can also be a platform as a service variant, and allows your application to leverage various search capabilities, whether it's search within the application itself, search of other resources on the internet, search of your databases, etc. Also, we have the ability to leverage external APIs. So the API as a service here presents, again, a unified interface to access these APIs, or at least to manage and orchestrate those APIs. And then finally, we show the presence of multiple security as a service offerings. Some of these, for example, may provide for identity and access management, for continuous security monitoring. There are a range of different security services that may be available. Some of them based on software as a service, some of them are platforms. And one other example I show here is the database as a service on the far lower right, which is itself a platform, but manages the underlying database. So, for example, whereas the relational databases on the upper right may be something that is implemented directly on top of infrastructure as a service and requires managing by the customer, the database as a service is a managed offering offered by the cloud service provider, and then you just need to know how to leverage it appropriately. There are actually a number of other of these services available. Some of the larger ones include container as a service. That's one that's gaining a lot of prevalence. A lot of people are using containers based on stuff like Docker and Kubernetes, and these container as a service offerings allow for the management of some of those resources and the orchestration of some of those resources. Storage as a service is another one, just sort of to allow for random objects to be stored in the cloud. There's also services for disaster recovery, etc. This is more federal perspective.
Things that are most important to know. When do you need a COTS waiver? You need a COTS waiver regardless of the threshold. So any FFP for a COTS product requires a waiver be submitted. As we said earlier, we're agnostic to products. It's about what works for the state, putting together the business case and submitting it to us, letting us know this is what you need and why, and providing the justification. With regard to customization, how much is too much? What you do need to know is customization is owned by the state if FFP was approved. And I don't know, Terry, did you want to speak to that a little bit more? Or?
Just a little bit. Basically, if you're using FFP to modify a commercial off-the-shelf product, you are, in effect, taking state ownership of that small piece of code. Now, how useful is that to another state? Well, they probably have to use the core system underneath it. But it's something to consider as you go forward. The more you customize, the more difficult it is to maintain your application, or at least that's the experience that we've seen in states that have done a lot of customization. Some applications, some COTS applications are better at making resources available to add customizations, add extensions that will be compatible with future updates to the core application or the core COTS. But you do want to be careful how much you want to do.
So with regard to the waiver request, when is it needed, and what COTS actually means? Was COTS developed specifically for the public assistance programs, child welfare being one of those programs? So it's developed specifically for child welfare. It will need to come in with a waiver, again, regardless of the cost, and then making sure that federal and state rights to the COTS documentation are included within the contract for that product.
If you're using a product built, principally built for Medicaid, and you're planning to use it, the same principle applies. So it's a little broader than we've indicated on this slide. You have to think of it in terms of any of the federal health and human service programs.
Next slide. I think that is the QA slide. So do we have any questions, Nicole?
We do not currently have any questions coming in through the chat line. If you would like to ask a question, please just send your question through the chat line.
Okay, if there are no questions, we'll take the next slide.
This one's for me. So what we've laid out here are a number of the different considerations or criteria that can be used to select among the various cloud service models. We've divided it into 3 large categories, one of which is requirements, one of which is resourcing, and one of which is quality and compliance. This is not necessarily a full set. There may be other considerations as well, and it's up to you for your state and tribe to choose and identify those criteria that are important in your particular circumstances, although we have tried to be largely thorough in touching each of these. What I will do on the next few slides is to give a few examples of how each one of these individual considerations can impact your choice among the cloud service models. One of the important things is to use your internal governance structure to make sure that all stakeholders are included in the vetting and decision-making process, to have clear and objective evaluation methods to assess the key considerations for your decision, and of course to record and communicate the decision-making process. I think that comparison of alternatives, which is to say a decision analysis and resolution process, might include, for example, a weighted average across the various selection criteria that you choose. And these could be, again, associated with the above criteria as well as other selection criteria. So the first example we have here is looking specifically at features and functionality requirements. So what we're trying to show here is how for this particular item, this particular consideration, the impact on the selection of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, how that consideration impacts each one of those. So the actual feature and functionality requirements for infrastructure as a service basically is all in the hands of the state or tribe. The reason for this is all features and functionality must be implemented on top of the infrastructure. So the underlying infrastructure as a service offering doesn't provide for features and functionality. For platform as a service, it's somewhat similar insofar as the state or tribe may need to implement custom features and functionality in combination with those provided by the underlying platform. So it might be somewhat reduced. Some of the features and functionality may be available, but in large part, the state or tribe is still implementing that those features and functionality. But the effort may be reduced because of those things that are already provided by the platform. And finally, for software as a service, essentially all features and functionality are provided by the cloud service provider. And in this case, it's important for the state or tribe to assess up front the degree to which the SAS offering provides for those features and functionality, because customization may be impossible or difficult. And so they should look at, what compromises are they making by leaving feature X out in favor of the efficiency that is obtained by leveraging the software as a service platform. So here's another example. This one's based on operation and maintenance costs. So for the case of both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, the O&M costs are fairly large. Both of these offerings require regular ongoing investment to maintain and operate the system. They require investment for continuous monitoring, for patching of all underlying infrastructure components, et cetera. For platform as a service, it's pretty much the same thing. There may be some reduction depending on the scope of the functionality that is provided by the cloud service provider for their platform. And similar to the earlier example, for software as a service, the O&M costs are quite a bit lower because all the application and infrastructure functionality, the operation and maintenance thereof, is covered by the cloud service provider. So the only thing really that needs to be maintained and operated is to ensure that the data is being retained properly, although that also should be provided by the SAS system. Next slide. And so the final example here is for quality control. Again, with infrastructure as a service, the quality control on the system that is developed is entirely in the hands of the state or tribe. And so there's a significant and ongoing state or tribe investment that's required, both in processes and testing, to ensure that the quality control across all environment tiers and for all system layers, components, interfaces, and data is in place. This is actually similar, again, for platform as a service. Especially in terms of making sure that testing suites are in place for regressions. There may be some reduction in quality control because there's no need to test the underlying platform itself, and the platform may in turn positively impact the quality of the application that is developed on top of it. And for software as a service, similar to what I was saying before, the state or tribe is only responsible for quality control of application data. The actual software as a service application and all the underlying platforms and infrastructure is handled by the cloud service provider. Again, these are just 3 examples of many, and it's important for states and tribes in evaluating the different options to consider these and many other considerations.
All right, let's break this down. We're constantly getting, do I need a COTS waiver? for this product or that product, and unfortunately I'm going to have to say it depends. And there are two equally fatal requirements that prohibit certain types of COTS products. And the first one we discussed a little bit about the programs covered by the APD regs for the HHS programs. FNS has a similar rule in their requirements. It says if the product is designed to support any one of those programs, because it's an HHS regulation, that's why I made that clarification when we were talking about it the first time. It's not specific to child welfare. If it's designed to meet one of our programs, you can't get FFP for it. The second one is a little more complex, and that is it's got to be available to the general public. So what does that mean? And over time, and been tested through claims to our Department of Appeals Board, we've determined that is the product available at an established cost and to the general public, meaning I don't have to go to the owner of the product to receive services. I can go to a third-party reseller. I can go to a third party that has the capability to implement.
Got a couple of tickets in the box. I'll take care of them.
We got somebody talking on the phone. Please mute your phones. But if it's available, if you can get the COTS product, the proprietary product from another vendor, you can service it through another vendor, we consider it available to the general public. So looking at the three main examples that Nick talked about, infrastructure as a service, for the most part, I would doubt that the infrastructure as a service needed a COTS waiver. Clearly, they're not designed for one of our programs, are probably not designed for one of our programs. And typically, these are available for support services from multiple vendors, multiple resellers, and vendors that can actually implement the tool on the proprietary product. Looking at platform as a system service, the same thing probably generally applies, that they're not designed for our program and you can get the product or support for the product through various resellers or support contractors. When you get to, and Nick mentioned this earlier, when you get to software as a service, well, it's definitely designed for our program, so you're going to need a waiver on that provision. And for the most part, they're not available through resellers. The vendor that owns it is the one that's maintaining it and is marketing it and is servicing it. So let's dive into a little bit of what this waiver says. If you've looked at it recently, you'll realize most of it is protections to the state. It ensures the state it has ownership of the data. It ensures the state that it has access to intellectual property. Should the vendor sell or go out of business, you can still use the product. So there are some things that get into a little bit of non-protections, but for the most part, it assures that you own your data, you have access to your data, and you have access to this intellectual property should something happen to the reseller. Should you decide you want to look for a new service or build up a new component, it requires the state to make sure that they have protections while they're doing that they won't lose access to the COTS product that they've come to depend upon. So, to my knowledge, I don't think we have denied any COTS waiver that we've received. Don't worry about this. You need to go through the process, but we're on your side here. We want to protect your interest. And we're going to walk you through a way to submit these. Sole source justification. Again, you're going to get a depends response. We do want you to discuss it with your specific analyst. We are looking for a business case, one, as to why you're doing a sole source, what's the advantage to the state, what's the advantage to the federal government, and we're also going to ask you to show us whether or not you have state rules that allow you to do this kind of sole source, to do a sole source. But talk to us about this. Talk to your analysts. We're trying to, we're not trying to make this an impossible hill to climb here. We're just having you give us the justifications.
Thank you, Terry. That's exactly where we are. So if you'd like to submit a question, please just submit it through the chat line. I do have one question for either Terry or Nicole. The question states, considering that COTS, PASS, SAS, and DBAS are becoming the norm in the market, are you considering that COTS waivers may no longer be needed and instead require a waiver for a custom build?
I don't really think that the COTS waiver requirements are that onerous if you really take time to look at them.
Thank you, Terry.
Is my answer.
Are there any other questions to pose at this time? Nicole Harter-Shafer, is there anything that you would like to add before we go to our wrap-up slide?
No. I am good.
Okay. Next slide, Denaro, please. So thank you for attending today. Please continue to submit your questions directly to your federal analyst. Next month's webinar is a part 2 of today's webinar. Next month's webinar, we will have state panels to provide their perspective, and those states will be at varying stages of either selection through implementation of their cloud service models.
I would also invite feedback to our webinar series, the topics that we bring up, things that we could do to improve them. The more information we get back from you, the better we can meet your needs and support your efforts as you design and develop these systems. So please let us know, either through your system analyst that you work with, or Nick Moser on our team, or myself, anyone on my team. Just let us know, and we'll be glad to take a look at topics for future webinars or ways to improve the ones that we've been doing.
There is one question. Please feel free to email Nick Moser at nicholas.moser, M-O-Z-E-R, @acf.hhs.gov. And with that, thank you for attending today, and have a good afternoon.
And a great holiday season.
Thank you, everyone.